The Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, O Lord. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. It would be easy to turn this story into a mere object lesson, with Peter at the center. Peter who sinks, Peter who doubts, Peter of little faith. Too little faith, not enough faith. In summary, don't be like Peter. Have more faith, just try harder. Keep your focus on Jesus. # faith over fear. How hard can it be? No doubt there is fear in this story. Don't forget where this chapter begins. Against the backdrop of political violence, in the shadow of grief, as Jesus mourns the death of his fellow preacher and friend John, who has just been executed in prison for pissing off the powers that be. The gospel writer doesn't tell us precisely what Jesus was feeling, but you don't exactly run off in a boat by yourself to a deserted place when everything is going great. Jesus is grieving. Jesus is troubled. Jesus is afraid, and he just wants to be alone. But the crowds are hot on his trail, turning not to solitude, but to their trusted teacher in their own grief. The crowds, too, are afraid. This is no moment to be alone. You know what comes next. That was last week's story, a brief interlude of a feeding miracle in which Jesus is moved to compassion at the sight of the wandering, restless, grieving, fearful crowd. And in their wandering and their restlessness and their fear and their grief, he draws them together and feeds them. And for a moment, they are all less alone. Hardly they have had a moment to gather up the leftovers, to pull out the mismatched Tupperware from the church kitchen and make sure everyone has tomorrow's lunch, when immediately Jesus makes the disciples get back into the boat. Matthew's word choice makes it clear that they don't really have much of a choice in the matter. Jesus compels them back into the boats. He is actively sending them away. I can only imagine what the disciples must have been thinking. This is hardly the time to split up. Not when the shadow of grief hangs long and heavy. Not when the threat of political violence looms. No doubt there is fear in this story as the disciples get back into the boat alone, wondering how or if they will make it to the other side. No doubt there is fear in this story as Jesus tries again to go off by himself to pray, carefully planning his next moves. Certainly there is fear in this story. In the midst of the storm, the disciples are terrified and they cry out in fear. It's a ghost. No, it's not. Take heart. It is I, ego eimi. I am. Do not be afraid. And Peter knows. You don't exactly jump out of a boat in the middle of a sea during a storm for just anyone, especially not a ghost. This is Jesus, whom Peter has come to know, whom he has seen do amazing things, whom he has heard preach with mighty power, with whom he has in fact been in the boat during a storm before, and whom he has heard rebuke the winds and bring the sea to a dead calm. Peter knows. There is fear in this story, and there is also great faith and trust. Peter knows, and he starts sinking anyway. But not because he loses sight of Jesus, still right in front of him, or because he forgets who Jesus is or what Jesus is capable of. But because he also notices the strong wind and, oh yeah, he's walking on freaking water. The presence of Jesus doesn't negate the presence of the storm. And that, I believe, gives us a beautifully honest and authentic description of faith. In a well-worn phrase from writer Anne Lamott, I turn to time and time again, the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. Peter can at once be faithful and fearful, simultaneously full of faith and full of questions. One doesn't negate the other, and in fact, I would be deeply skeptical of a faith that does claim to have all the answers. Peter knows, but that doesn't mean he can never be afraid, or ask questions, or have doubts. One pastor eloquently puts it this way in a commentary this week. Faith is not simply learning something about God once and never struggling again. Faith is the lifelong process of remembering who God has already shown God's self to be. And Peter remembers. There is fear in this story, and there is also great faith. As Peter, sinking without hesitation, cries out to the one he knows can save him. Lord, save me, Peter cries out instantly. Lord, save me, Peter cries out because he knows Jesus can. That refrain itself is a bold declaration of great faith. And Jesus immediately does just that, reaching out his hand to catch Peter and pull him up. No doubt there is fear in this story. The presence of Jesus doesn't negate the presence of the storm. And there is also great faith in this story. The presence of the storm doesn't negate the presence of Jesus. In the midst of a relentless, boat-battering, terrifying storm, there is Jesus, hand outstretched to pull us back up. In the midst of fear and the long shadow of grief, there is Jesus, hands outstretched, full of bread to feed us. Having faith doesn't promise there will be no more storms, no more grief, no more fear. The promise is so much more profound than that, assuring us that there is one who is right there with us through it all.